Hi, Mr. Stu. Hi, back to you. I love the ones that are like, hey there, Mr. Stu. Hello, Mr. Stu. Mr. Stu. Ah. It makes me feel good. Hi, Mr. Stu. Hi, back to you. I think my child needs some help, but I'm hesitant to pursue a diagnosis because I don't want them to be labeled. How can I ensure that focus? How can I ensure that the focus remains on their growth and not just a diagnosis? Great question. This is one that comes up pretty often, and it's also one that prevents people from jumping into therapy in the first place. It makes people uncomfortable when we start to bring up a diagnosis in therapy. It's sometimes the reason people stop doing therapy or maybe don't tell the school about a diagnosis because they're afraid that their child is going to be labeled. And if I'm honest, it's a valid concern. A lot of times, different people view diagnoses in different ways. And it can be hard sometimes if your child goes into certain environments with a diagnosis and shares that they have that diagnosis. It can be difficult in certain places. I can also say that in most places, or at least in a lot of places, maybe I shouldn't say most, but at least in a lot of places in today's world, diagnoses are just viewed as just something. We've kind of come to the understanding that everybody has something. Whether or not they've been to a professional and it's been labeled, everybody's kind of got something. As a matter of fact, during many of my trainings, I talk about the brain and I show the neurotypical brain, and I try to emphasize that the neurotypical brain doesn't really exist. There is no perfectly working brain in the world. All of us kind of have something going on. And then some of us have more extreme things going on that actually lead to disorders. Some of us have just learned to tolerate and move through life with a disorder. Everybody's a little bit different. And luckily in today's world, we kind of understand that. So breathe easy knowing that in a lot of environments, your child will not be labeled as anything just because they have a diagnosis. Another side of that, another therapist that I work with and we have talked about how really a diagnosis is only for insurance purposes. The way that I do therapy, I use a method that's called child-centered play therapy. And child-centered play therapy is the same for every child, no matter their diagnosis. And it's evidence-based for every diagnosis and every age group. So children with autism, ADHD, depression, adults with trauma, adults with personality disorders. It's evidence-based to help all groups. And many therapists use things like that. Many therapists use modalities that can kind of be applied across a diagnosis, and a diagnosis specifically doesn't change a whole lot of what we do. We just have to report a diagnosis to an insurance company so that they will fund us so that we can give your child the support that they need. I say all that to say really a diagnosis is not the most important thing about your child. The most important thing about your child is that there's some type of disorder or some type of disruption that needs some help. So whatever you want to call it, they need some help. And that is really what this comes down to. I understand you don't want your child to be labeled or mislabeled, and that happens pretty often too. But understand that a diagnosis is not a death sentence, and it's not a permanent fixture of your child. Even with things like autism spectrum disorder, it used to be believed that where someone was on the autism spectrum, that's just where they are, and it's where they're always going to be no matter what. They've just got to kind of learn to tolerate it, and everybody else has to kind of learn to pick up all the pieces. We know that that is no longer the case. People with autism can move up and down the spectrum depending on the amount of support they receive and the way that their brains kind of click in at different times. And that's true of almost every diagnosis, that people can sometimes even completely healed of various diagnoses. But at least they can start to tolerate that diagnosis or learn to live with that diagnosis or learn supports for that diagnosis to where it's no longer a disorder, and then the diagnosis is no longer valid. Keep that in mind, that a diagnosis, very few diagnoses are permanent. There's almost no permanent diagnoses in children. And I gave the example of autism spectrum disorder. Even in children with autism spectrum disorder, that's not a permanent, fixed diagnosis, especially the level that they're at. It can move up and down and all across, and same with depression, same with ADHD, same with PTSD. All those diagnoses have a big wide spectrum of different symptoms, and your child can improve, and then many of those diagnoses can actually be completely alleviated with proper supports. Keep that in mind as you are seeking support for your child, that it's not a label. It's not their name. Their name is not Bobby with ADHD. Their name is not Susie with depression. Their name is not Tony with autism. That's not their name. It's not their label. It's not who they are. It's a thing that's going on that needs some support. And if you can approach it with that mindset, and really know that therapists, the only reason we give a diagnosis is just for an insurance company. Just so the insurance knows there really is something that's going on. You really do need to pay us so that we can help this person. When you understand that, a diagnosis becomes much less scary. It's not a permanent thing. It's not something that's fixed by any means. And it's not a name. It's not a label. It's not a death sentence. It is just the thing that's going on that needs some help. If you can approach it that way, hopefully that can help you have a little more courage to reach out and get the support that your child needs. And that's what it's really all about. You might be really nervous, but they are really hurting. So they need some help. Don't let your fear keep them from getting what it is that they need.